Hi, everybody. So at this point, we've talked about Lamarck and how he tried to explain changes in species over time. But he had some silly ideas that species simply got things because they used them, and that once you got something during your life, you could pass them to your offspring. And we know that's not true, but we're left with this big question. How do species change over time? We have fossils and similarities of species that tell us that they probably change over time, but how can that happen? We know that we're the same species as our parents and our grandparents, and where does this magical change happen? And it really comes down to these two guys, Darwin and Wallace, who developed our current theory. And I want to, before we go into the notes specifically, I want to kind of give you a little imaginary story to get an idea of what they said happens. So I'd like you to imagine that we have a class of 30 students, and we are the last 30 people left on the planet. There's nobody else, just us 30. We're it, but there's only enough food to support half of us. So 15 people will get enough food, and they will have enough food for themselves and their offspring. And the question is, who will survive? Now, there are a lot of different things that can determine whether individuals survive. Sometimes it's simply luck, but a lot of times it has to do with things like, are they faster, smarter, better able to work with others, stronger, taller, like the giraffe, or simply maybe slower, able to conserve lots of energy. There's lots of different traits that can be useful at different times. But I'd like to imagine for the moment that the only thing that matters to whether these 30 people are going to survive is whether they can run fast or not. The ones that can get to the food first survive and get to have offspring. The rest of us who are slow will starve and die. So let's imagine that for a moment. So let's imagine a population where about half are slow and about half are fast. So on average, we're medium speed. We've got half our population is fast and half our population is slow. And so we're medium fast as a group. As a species, we're medium fast. Now, the fast ones are all going to run to the food, and they're going to eat, and they're going to survive, and they are going to have offspring. And so they're going to pass their traits on, and we are going to have a bunch of baby fast ones, right? The slow ones all died off, and the fast runners have had babies. And so now we have 30 individuals, 15 adults, and their offspring, and they're all fast. Now, how does this population, this new population, compare to the old population? Well, if we think back, we had a bunch of slow and a bunch of fast. So on average, the population was medium speed. What about this population? Faster, right? Because we've lost all those slow genes. Those died out of the population. We've only got these fast genes left. So this is a much faster population on average. That's evolution. That's all evolution really is. We have a particular trait that's more useful than another trait, and those individuals survive better and have more offspring. And on average, the population is faster. That is not to say that person A got faster. Nope. Person A was born fast, lucky, got to survive, got to pass on their traits. Child A has inherited that gene, and slow person's genes have been removed. So on average, the population has gotten faster. That's what evolution is. Darwin called it natural selection. So we have our theory of natural selection. Keep in mind that the word theory in science is the opposite of outside of science. Outside of science, when you say it's just a theory, it means it's not really sure. We're not totally positive. In science, it's the opposite. It means everything we've ever observed is supports this idea. And so it is as close to solid true as we can get in explaining things. So the theory of natural selection is supported by everything we see, so we call it a theory. All right. Now, what I'd like to do is go back to our original population, our medium speed population. And I'd like you to consider a different scenario for them now. We've got slow people, we've got slow people, we've got fast people, and they're the only ones left in the world, but there's enough food for 30. Everybody gets to live. What's the next generation gonna look like? The slow ones will get to eat and reproduce, and the fast ones will get to eat and reproduce, and the next generation will have all their genes, will pass on slow genes and fast genes, and the next generation will, on average, still be medium speed. And so there won't be any evolution. And so Darwin said there has to be overproduction for there to be evolution. That is, there have to be more babies born than will survive. If everybody gets to live, no evolution. Evolution depends on there being winners and losers. There have to be genes removed from the population. If there aren't, then on average, the population stays the same. He called that overproduction. So we have to have more babies born than will survive to adulthood for there to be natural selection. Okay, so let's go back to the original population again. Let's say we have 30 left in the world. They're the only ones left. And there's only enough food for 15. We're back to that problem. We have got overproduction. Check. But let's say instead we have 30 fast individuals. There aren't any slow. On average, this is a fast population already. But there's only enough food for 15. In fact, these 30 people are identical in every way. And there's only enough food for 15. Who gets to survive? It'll be luck. It'll just be luck. Who knows who's going to get to survive? Whoever's closest to the food, right? It's all going to be sheer luck. And when 15 of these individuals survive and they have babies and they pass on their genes are identical to the original population. So when they have their babies, they're going to be identical to these individuals. And will there have been evolution? No, you cannot have evolution if you have a population without variation. Variation is the other thing that he said must be in the population. You have to have some winners and losers, and they have to be different. Nature has to be selecting between different things. There has to be variation. Can't be identical. Now, this always is unfortunate. Darwin picked a really lousy word for the next term. He called a useful trait. Now, what was the useful trait in our example? Being fast. He called any trait that is particularly useful in the population an adaptation. I want you to be really, really careful. Do not use that as a verb. Nobody is adapting to anything. You are either born fast and you're lucky and you have an adaptation, or you were born slow and you won't get the food and you will die. That's it. There is no, I was born slow, but I have to be fast to get the food, so I'm going to adapt to it. If you take a snake out of the rainforest and drop it at the North Pole, it does not get to grow a fur coat. We don't adapt to things. If you are a snake and you are pulled out of the rainforest and you are dropped at the North Pole, you will die because you were not born with an adaptation for that environment. So what's unfortunate is that Darwin picked this word because so many students and so many of us will talk about adapting to an environment. That's not what happens. You're born lucky, you live, you pass on your genes. Or you're born unlucky, you die, and you don't pass on your genes. If you were able to adapt to your environment, who would you be sounding like? Lamarck, right? And Lamarck was wrong. You don't get to change because your environment makes that new trait useful. You just don't. You just die. So you're either lucky and you have an adaptation. Use it as a noun. Do not say you adapt to something. No individual is adapting. A species, on average, will change from generation to generation, where the losers die out and that gene becomes less frequent. And he called this whole thing natural selection. That is, those with the useful trait survive better, have more offspring, and the frequency of that trait increases. Natural selection. Now, there's one really big problem with this whole thing, and that is, why are there slow and fast people? Where'd that come from? Why aren't we all identical? I mean, if we all came from a common ancestor, then why aren't we all just like the common ancestor? How did there get to be fast individuals and slow individuals, or giraffes with shorter necks and taller necks? Like, where did that happen? Now, Darwin could not explain that. Darwin had no ability to explain that because of the time he was born in, there was no understanding of something that we already know, we've already talked about in this year. And that is that new traits can arise in a population when what? When there are changes to DNA, when there are mutations, and there are lots of things in the world causing these variations. But he could not explain, Darwin could not explain variation. But we know that changes in DNA happen all the time. When UV radiation hits our DNA, it changes it. There's all sorts of mutagens out there that change our DNA, and most of them are lousy and kill us. But every once in a while, it might mean faster or taller or growing fur or whatever might be particularly useful in the population. It's like a freebie new ticket, you know? It's like a great new chance for the population where there might not have been a chance for survival. So mutations are good because they add variation, which allows a species to evolve in the face of changes in the environment. So when we talked about mutations before, I said some of them are good. Imagine if we were all identical as a population and one of us was susceptible to a disease. That would mean we all were. But if there's variation and a new disease comes, if it kills some people, it doesn't mean it's going to wipe out the whole population. Variation is so important. It's the fuel for being able as a species to adapt and change and evolve. That is, to have possible new traits that can increase in frequency in the face of new changes in the environment. The other source of variation is sex. Sexual reproduction mixes and matches new genes together, right? Half from mom, half from dad, and you get new variations of combinations of traits, and that also introduces variation. And that's why sexual reproduction is such an important adaptation in itself, because it adds so much variation. If you're a population that's reproducing asexually, then the entire population is identical. And if a disease comes to wipe out one, the whole thing is gone. So you really lose out on a lot of the options for adaptations for evolution, for natural selection. Sexual reproduction, as you may recall, requires cutting a chromosome number in half during meiosis and then combining those together in new ways during fertilization. And that is natural selection.